An ordinary trip to a suburban farmer's market turns into an unforgettable confrontation when a middle-aged man responds to a hateful remark with grace and dignity. What he says next doesn't just silence the market, it leaves everyone reflecting. It was a bright Saturday morning in Charleston, South Carolina. The local farmer's market was bustling with activity. Families browsed fresh produce, children giggled near the flower stalls, and vendors shouted out deals for sweet peaches and ripe tomatoes. Among the lively crowd, 36-year-old Marcus, a black entrepreneur who ran his own small business, strolled through the market. Dressed in a casual green polo shirt and khaki shorts, Marcus held a reusable shopping bag in one hand and scrolled through his phone with the other, checking off items on his grocery list. Near a stall of freshly picked apples, an elderly woman in her early 80s adjusted her wide-brimmed sun hat as she reached for a bag of apples. Her floral dress swayed lightly in the breeze, but her demeanor was far from gentle. She muttered under her breath, impatient as she sorted through the fruit. As Marcus approached the same stall to grab a bag of oranges, her demeanor changed. She turned sharply, narrowing her eyes at him. Her voice, loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear, broke through the lively chatter. "You people don't belong here," she said, her tone laced with bitterness. Marcus froze. His hand hovered over the oranges as he processed her words. He glanced at her, confused. Before he could respond, she added sharply, "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The market grew quiet. Nearby shoppers stopped in their tracks, exchanging uneasy glances. Some pretended not to hear, while others stared openly at the scene unfolding before them. The rhythm of the market came to a halt, replaced by an awkward silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus took a slow breath, his face unreadable. He straightened his posture, standing tall, and shifted his bag to his other hand. Around him, a young vendor stocking strawberries froze mid-major, unsure whether to intervene. A mother pulled her child closer, casting nervous glances toward the elderly woman. Instead of retaliating, Marcus allowed himself a moment to think. His voice, when it finally came, was calm but resolute. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured and deliberate, "do you even realize what you're saying?" The woman didn't flinch. Her posture remained defiant as she clutched her apples. "I said what I said," she snapped. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Marcus didn't falter. Instead, he placed his shopping bag on the ground and turned fully to face her. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice gaining strength. "This is your country, but it's mine too." The crowd leaned in, captivated. Marcus continued, his words carrying the weight of history. "My great-grandfather was born in Charleston, not far from here. He was a farmer who worked the land, not because he wanted to, but because he was forced to. My grandfather fought in World War II, risking his life for the freedoms we all enjoy today. And my parents? They worked hard to make sure I could have opportunities they didn't." The woman's face flushed as Marcus spoke, but she said nothing. "You telling me I don't belong here?" Marcus shook his head slightly. "Ma'am, I've paid my dues, and so has my family. We've worked, fought, and sacrificed for this country, just like you. So, let me be clear, I belong here as much as anyone." The silence was deafening. A vendor near the honey stall clapped hesitantly, and others soon followed. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by quiet reflection. The elderly woman looked around, her expression softening slightly, but she didn't apologize. She turned and walked toward the exit, her apples clutched tightly. Marcus bent down to pick up his bag, his calm demeanor unwavering. A younger man approached him, extending a hand. "Thank you," he said. "What you said, it needed to be said." Marcus smiled faintly and nodded. "Sometimes, the truth is all we need to say." As the market returned to its lively chatter, the incident lingered in everyone's minds. It wasn't just an ordinary trip to the farmer's market anymore. It was a moment of reckoning, a reminder of the power of dignity and truth in the face of ignorance. "I could have walked away," he said, addressing the entire crowd now, his voice resonating with a quiet strength that seemed to touch every corner of the store. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't change in silence. It grows." And it's not just up to people like me to challenge it. It's up to all of us. The room remained still, the weight of his words hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. A young man near the canned goods aisle, who had been quietly watching, nodded in agreement, his gaze fixed on Marcus. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she shifted her weight, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She opened her mouth again, but seemed to think better of it and closed it, her expression unreadable. Marcus turned his attention back to her, his voice softening but maintaining its conviction. "Mom, I understand that the world is changing and that can be scary, but clinging to hate or fear only makes things worse. We're all here together, trying to live our lives, take care of our families and do the best we can. Isn't that what really matters?" The crowd, which had initially been silent, began to stir. A middle-aged woman near the bakery section spoke up, her voice trembling but clear. "He's right," she said, addressing no one in particular. "We can't keep treating people like this. It's not who we are, or at least, it's not who we should be." The murmurs grew louder, shifting from discomfort to agreement. A man in his 70s, leaning heavily on a cane, nodded thoughtfully. "I fought in Korea," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "And I didn't fight for a country where we treat people like they don't belong. That's not what we stand for." The elderly woman looked around, her face now pale and drawn. The defiance that had fueled her earlier words seemed to crumble under the weight of the crowd's quiet judgment. She adjusted her cardigan, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, and whispered, "I didn't mean, I just—" Marcus held up a hand, stopping her. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter, actions matter even more, and now you have the chance to choose better." For a moment it seemed as if she might respond, but instead, she turned and began pushing her cart toward the exit. The crowd parted for her, their gazes a mixture of pity and disapproval. Marcus watched her go, his expression unreadable, before bending to pick up his shopping basket. As he turned back to the produce section, a young cashier approached him hesitantly. "That was incredible," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for standing up like that." Marcus gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Sometimes," he said, "you just have to speak the truth and hope it reaches the right ears." The atmosphere in the store shifted as the crowd slowly dispersed. Shoppers returned to their tasks, but there was a noticeable change in the air, a sense of reflection, of understanding that hadn't been there before. A few people stopped Marcus to thank him quietly, their words heartfelt and sincere. Later, as he walked to his car, the sun casting long shadows across the parking lot, Marcus felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. He hadn't planned to make a stand that day, but sometimes life presented moments when silence wasn't an option. As he loaded his groceries into the trunk, he glanced back toward the store and saw a young child waving at him through the window. He waved back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Driving home, Marcus thought about what had just happened. He knew the woman might never fully change her perspective, but he also knew he'd planted a seed, not just in her, but in everyone who had been watching. Change, he reminded himself, often started small, with a conversation, a moment of truth, or a quiet stand against ignorance. The day's events were a reminder of something his father used to say: "Strength isn't in how loud you are, it's in how steady you stay." Marcus held on to that thought as he pulled into his driveway, ready to unpack his groceries and continue his day, knowing he'd done more than shop for food. He'd made a difference. As Marcus loaded his groceries into the trunk of his car, he glanced back one more time at the woman in her car. She was still sitting there, her hands gripping the wheel as if she were holding on to something more than just control of her vehicle. Perhaps guilt, perhaps confusion, or maybe even the beginning of understanding. Marcus sighed softly, deciding that whatever came next for her wasn't up to him anymore. He had done his part. Driving home, Marcus couldn't help but replay the scene in his mind. The confrontation, the crowd's reaction, and the woman's final departure all played out like scenes from a movie. He didn't regret standing up for himself, far from it. But he couldn't help wondering if his words had truly made a difference, or if they'd simply been forgotten as soon as the moment had passed. As he turned onto his street, the sight of his neighbor, Mrs. Wilson, tending to her rose bushes brought a sense of normalcy back to his day. She waved at him, her face lighting up with the warmth of familiarity. Marcus parked his car, stepped out, and exchanged a few pleasantries with her before heading inside. The mundane task of putting away groceries offered a welcome distraction, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman in the store and the collective shift he had felt in the atmosphere. Later that evening, as the golden hues of sunset faded into the cool blues of dusk, Marcus sat on his porch with a cup of tea. The quiet chirping of crickets provided a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. His phone buzzed beside him, a text from his sister, asking how his day had gone. He hesitated for a moment before typing a simple response. "Eventful but good, I'll call you tomorrow." The elderly woman, meanwhile, sat alone at her dining table, her untouched cup of tea growing cold. Marcus's words echoed in her mind, each one chiseling away at the rigid walls of her long-held beliefs. She thought about her late husband, who had fought in the same war Marcus's grandfather had, and how he had always spoken of unity and brotherhood. The realization that she might have betrayed those values stung deeply. Days turned into weeks, and the story of the grocery store encounter quietly spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Marcus's calm courage and the dignity with which he had handled the situation. Some spoke of it as a lesson, a reminder of the importance of standing up against ignorance without resorting to anger or hostility. One afternoon, as Marcus returned from work, he found a handwritten note tucked into his mailbox. It was unsigned, but the elegant cursive handwriting was unmistakably hers. "I owe you an apology," it began. "Not just for what I said, but for the years of prejudice that led me to say it. You showed me something I didn't think I needed to see. Thank you for your patience and grace. I will try to do better." Marcus read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. It wasn't about the apology itself, it was about what it represented. Growth, change, the possibility that even the hardest hearts could soften. That evening, as the weeks passed, Marcus noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. People seemed kinder, more patient with one another. Whether it was his imagination or a genuine shift, he couldn't be sure. What he did know was that moments like the one in the grocery store mattered. They were small ripples that, over time, could become waves. Marcus's encounter had taught him an important lesson too. Strength wasn't always about standing tall in the face of adversity. Sometimes, it was about knowing when to speak, how to listen, and trusting that truth, spoken with kindness, could break through the hardest barriers. He took another sip of tea as the stars began to twinkle above, feeling a quiet sense of hope for what lay ahead. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone on his porch, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air as he reflected on his father's words. The weight of the day felt lighter now, softened by the understanding that his actions had resonated not just with those in the grocery store, but perhaps even with the woman who had confronted him. He leaned back in his chair, sipping a cup of tea, and let his mind wander. Planting seeds, his father's metaphor stayed with him. Change didn't happen overnight, but the potential for it was enough to inspire hope. Across town, the elderly woman sat in her small living room, a framed photo of her late husband resting on the table beside her. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the glass as she stared into his familiar face. He had always been the calm one, the one who believed in treating people with kindness, regardless of who they were. His words from decades ago echoed in her mind. "It doesn't cost anything to listen, and you might learn something you didn't know before." She sighed, wondering what he would think of her actions that day. For the first time in years, she felt compelled to question the beliefs she had carried for so long. In the days that followed, the story of what happened at the store continued to ripple through the community. People who had been present shared the encounter with friends and neighbors. The cashier told her family about Marcus's composure and grace, and how it had inspired her to reconsider how she approached difficult situations. Others spoke of the power in Marcus's words, how they had struck a chord and left an indelible mark. Marcus, however, went about his life without much thought to the attention. He wasn't seeking recognition. For him, it was enough to know that he had spoken his truth, and done so with dignity. But as he went about his daily errands, he noticed subtle changes in the way people interacted. Strangers smiled more warmly. Conversations seemed a bit kinder, more thoughtful. A sense of reflection had taken hold in his small neighborhood. Weeks later, as Marcus walked to his car after another trip to the grocery store, he noticed the elderly woman standing near the exit. She hesitated, clutching her purse tightly, before finally stepping forward. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice wavering, I want to say I'm sorry. For what I said. For how I acted." Marcus looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he nodded. "Thank you," he said simply. "It means a lot that you took the time to say that." She nodded in return, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm trying," she whispered. "I'll keep trying." As Marcus drove home, he couldn't help but smile faintly. His father's words had proven true. Sometimes all it took was planting a seed and letting it grow. The world might not change all at once, but every small step mattered. Every conversation, every moment of understanding brought it closer to a better place. The story of Marcus and his calm yet impactful response to ignorance is a powerful reminder that true strength lies in grace, patience, and speaking truth with conviction. In my life, this resonates deeply, especially when faced with moments of misunderstanding or prejudice. It's easy to react with anger or frustration, but this story highlights the importance of staying composed and using those moments to educate and inspire change. Applying this lesson means choosing to respond thoughtfully when faced with negativity, whether in personal relationships or professional settings. It encourages reflecting on my own actions and how I can influence others by leading with kindness, even in challenging situations. By planting seeds of understanding, just as Marcus did, I can contribute to creating a ripple effect of empathy and awareness in my community. This story reminds me that even small actions, like calmly addressing a hurtful comment, can have a profound and lasting impact. It's not about changing the world overnight, but about making meaningful connections and fostering growth, one interaction at a time. In my daily life, I'll strive to choose words and actions that heal, unite, and encourage understanding, just as Marcus did.